Hey guys, I'm Papa Pete, and welcome to today's episode of the 125. Now, the 125 is a web-based show that focuses on the reviews as well as gameplay from one of the 125 different Intellivision games that were released for the system between 1979 and 1989. It's a little bit different than your typical show because each episode actually consists of more than one video. There's going to be a video talking about the game and giving a bit of a review. That's the one you're watching right now. But it's also going to be accompanied by some gameplay videos with examples of the gameplay from whatever game we're talking about at that time. So for today's game, we have a very special one of the launch titles. We're looking at Armor Battle, released in 1979. Here we go. Tank games were a very popular genre back in the mid-70s. It started off shortly after Pong. They diversified a little bit. We had things like the Coleco Telstar Combat released. I don't know if you remember that system or not. As well as, of course, Atari Combat, which was not only big in the arcades, but it was the original pack-in game for the Atari 2600 system. In preparation for the release of the Mattel Intellivision, Mattel knew they had to have a strong entry into this genre. They had to have a strong tank battle game to release. So they got APH Technological Consulting, specifically Chris Kingsley, to be the programmer for the game. And when they did the test market release in 1979, Armor Battle was one of the very few games that were released with that test system. One little known fact about Armor Battle for the Intellivision was that the original title, the working title for it as it was being developed at APH, was Tanks a Lot. And it made it a long way through the development process before Mattel picked up on this and actually came back and said, no, that's a stupid name, change it to something more generic, and it got the name Armor Battle. Now, even though the game was actually formally released September 4th, 1980, it is known as one of the very first games put out. It was one of the very first ones developed. And to keep up with the idea that Mattel Intellivision was leaps and bounds ahead of Atari and other systems at the time, just technologically better, Mattel knew they had to have a very strong game with good graphics, good gameplay, and things that the other games just didn't offer. Armor Battle is a two-player only game. Very common for that time. We've talked about that before. There wasn't much AI technology that allowed computer-based opponents. So this was a two-player only game. And it was played on one of 240 different maps. Each player got two different tanks. There was a black player and there was a blue player. And like I said, they had two tanks. And they could switch back and forth between the two because they could only control one at a time. That being said, your opponent was also switching back and forth between tanks as they battled you out on the game screen. As I said, it was very easy to distinguish between the two different tanks that you had on the screen. The one that you're controlling, the one you weren't controlling. The one that you're controlling had a 3D type aspect to it, and the other one was very flat, very 2D. And you could switch back and forth with a simple key press on the keypad. Now, the tank that you were controlling, you could adjust the direction that it was facing by holding down on a certain direction, the same direction that you wanted to face, on the gamepad itself. You basically rotated either clockwise or counterclockwise, whichever one was closer, to match the facing position of the direction you were pushing on the game disc. Now, in order to move at the same time, you use the lower side buttons. So you could move forward at the same time that you were turning and move all around the screen. In order to shoot, whatever direction your gun was aiming, you could hit the top button and the shot will come out straight towards your opponent as best as you could aim. If you could fire your cannon and hit an enemy tank 3 times, the enemy tank blew up and that was how you won the round. You tried to blow up both of your opponent's tanks and then you would move on to the next round. It seems simple enough. Line up your gun at one of your enemy tanks, especially if it's the one that's not moving, and just fire away. But there's something that was really interesting, and they incorporated a recoil effect into the guns. Every time that you fired your gun, it was like the recoil within the cannon itself, and it sort of twisted the cannon off the same line of fire. And you used to have to readjust after every shot. It was a really neat element that they added. Another interesting gameplay element that they added was the ability for each player to lay one mine on each screen. In other words, each round of play of 2 tanks, Each player had one mine delay, and it was really interesting because it was just a matter of being in a certain spot, pushing a button on the keypad, and then getting off that spot as quickly as possible, because the mines were completely invisible. And any tank, friendly or your enemy, who went back into that area during that round of gameplay was instantly blown up. Now, to make it even more interesting, remember I said you get off that spot quickly? Well, if you laid the mine, you had 5 seconds to get off that spot, or you'd end up blowing up your own tank. Like I said before, each round was finished whenever one of the two players lost their 2 tanks. But the main game screen started off both players with 50 tanks. It wasn't very realistic to play an entire game of 50 tanks. I don't recall if I ever did that the whole time that we had it when I was younger. But I do recall that the manual says right in it that you just pick a number that you want to play. You could play by rounds. You could play, let's say, 10 rounds, and whoever wins 10 rounds first, or the most of the 10 rounds, or you just pick number of tanks. Whoever gets down to, let's say, 40 tanks first wins. So it's really kind of interesting. You could do it different ways, but the game itself didn't have a very good method of determining a winner. Now I want to get back to one of the elements I brought up briefly right at the very start of this, and that was the different maps that you play on. And a lot of the times you'll read that there's a randomly generated map that includes things like water and trees in the forest and roads and such. And although it's sort of true, it's not really that true. It's not a randomly generated map each and every time. That sort of makes you envision the fact that you never know where it's going to go. Well, the truth be known, there was 240 different maps, all pre-drawn, and when you started a new round, one of those 240 maps was selected, and that's what you played on. And that was just a little bit, it had to remember the individual maps, the computer itself, the Intellivision itself, did not have to generate the different types of items into the gameplay map. Now, let's talk about the different elements on the gameplay map themselves. There's, like I said, I already mentioned water. Water was very clear. It didn't provide any protection, but it was very, very slow to move through. There were roads on the course, which were very fast to move on, but again, didn't block any shots. Then you'd have things like the forest, which, yes, they slowed you down as you went through them, but you could fire in and out of the forest, but you never knew when your shot was going to get blocked by a tree, so it was sort of random. You could hide in the forest, and they might have a hard time getting a shot in to hit you, but at the same time, you might have a hard time getting a shot out at them as well. The other thing that was most prominent were the buildings. There's various buildings on most of the maps, and these buildings you could hide behind. Shots would not go through them, but at the same time you couldn't fire out from behind them. You always had to stick a little part of your tank out in order to get a shot around them, and you could not move through them. There was no running over the buildings in this game. But anyway, all these different elements in various configurations of the 240 different maps made for very unexpected and sometimes exciting gameplay. Overall, I call the graphics in Armor Battle to be very good. They're very good when you look back at them now. You can really differentiate between the different elements. Whether it's the tanks, you can tell which tank you're controlling and which tank you're not. You can see the building clearly. You can see the forest. There's no water on this particular screen here, but when there is water, you can really tell the bright blue water that's there. And you can see the roads even. So it really is very well done. And frankly, back in that day and age, it was exceptional graphics. So I'm going to give the graphics a very good rating. The goal was to improve upon the different tank battle games that were out already at that time, and Armor Battle definitely did that. Although it's far from complicated, the sounds in Armor Battle are efficient. There's the firing of the gun, there's the striking when a bullet hits a cannon, there's the big explosions when one of the tanks actually blows up. The only other sound really involved in the game is the sound of the engine of the tank itself going. And as you go faster, the pitch of the movement sound changes. So like when you get drudged down in the forest or in a lake, it really slows down and lowers. And you can tell the speed of the tank by the sound as well as what you can see. So is it exceptional? Is it really special? No, there's nothing special about the sounds in Armor Battle, but they certainly are adequate. One thing I like to say about Armor Battle is that this is one of the very first games that we had to play back when I was a kid, 12, 13 years old, and Intellivision was just coming onto the scene. I can still remember my brother-in-law went up. He had ordered the Intellivision online, but was going to Bangor, Maine for the weekend, and he picked up this and a couple other games and brought it back home. And we were so anxious to play it, but the Intellivision itself wasn't in yet. Oh, it was such a difficult thing. We sat and we looked at these games and we weren't able to play them. And I think it was a couple weeks because there were some difficulties with the order. And eventually he went and did end up paying a lot more money, but bought it locally in a small electronics store. Anyway, that being said, I've been playing this game for 30 or 40 years. And I really have always, it's had a special place in my heart because of it. Now, let's get back to some of the other elements of it. It is a two-player only game. You can't play it against the computer. Sometimes it's hard to find people to play it against back in those days. And often when we did have a little bit of time, my brother-in-law could play or we could get other people together to play. This was not always our first choice to play. And I think the reason is a couple things. First of all, the gameplay itself, although it's strong, the graphics are strong, it's better than combat. There was elements about it like the fact that it had 50 tanks and you just sort of played it till you got bored with it. And sometimes that happens sooner than later. I know exactly what they were trying to do, but overall, it just didn't bite us like some games did, like baseball or other two-player games like Utopia, which we just find more interesting to play head-to-head. There's no denying that this is a classic game. It was quite highly thought of back in that day because it was such a quote-unquote graphical and technological improvement over top of games like the Telstar Combat game or Atari Combat. But at the end of the day, it just wasn't something that we would play all the time or would even be near our first selection to pick up and put in the system when we wanted to play a game. Yes, the graphics are good. Yes, the sounds were okay, but at the end of the day, when you think about the gameplay and the fun factor that was involved, not only today, but also back at the time, I'm afraid I can only give Armor Battle a 4 out of 10 rating. Well, guys, that's it for today's episode of the 125. Thanks a lot for watching. I can't believe I used that joke. But anyway, don't forget to hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel because I'm going to be having one of these episodes out. Hopefully, the goal is every 2 weeks as I climb my way through the 125 original games released for the Intellivision back from 1979 to 1989. And I'm going to have a lot of fun doing it. So, we'll see you again next time here, guys, on the 125. Thanks a lot. Oh, that's sad.
Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. Papa Pete, the old ass gamer. If you haven't grown up by the age of 50,